Hey guys, what's up? I like to whistle while I work. Welcome to my live stream Friday night, 4:09 p.m. Well, it's not night, I guess. It's hard for me to tell these days, but yeah, it's a good time of day. And I've got some reading glasses I'm gonna try. Oh my God. Well, they do make things bigger, but I could see myself getting really annoyed by these. How do people wear them? Actually, my eyesight's pretty good, guys. I'm doing okay. Um, as you can see by the screen, I'm getting ready to do these releases of 2095 and 211, get them out of the way, because it's pretty solid right now. We've got a lot of patches in that are good, that are holding it together. Holding it together, guys. But yeah, I've got a bunch of folks excited because I put out this stuff on Twitter about, alternative ways to get the configuration configured. Of course, we do have to, we have this whole thing where we do builds where, yes, you do builds that are tailored to your particular setup, but, we've got all these boards with plenty of space on them now, and of course, RAM. We could make our fast I/O stuff work with, oi, variable pin numbers, and so that's an option that I'm looking at building, which is basically just making, instead of, like, if you right now when you put a pin number in, it resolves down to a number, some index number, and so you could have a table that resolves to, instead of just going to the way it's resolved now is it ends up being merged in with a macro name, and well, sometimes it's passed on. It depends on the situation, but so you got fast I/O, and basically, as long as you name the pin, you mention the pin that you're talking about, it gets, the right kind of code. But the idea is that it's done right then and there and as quickly as possible. So, the idea is that it's very optimal. There is a cool thing though that in some cases the RAM is faster to read than like ROM. So it depends on your situation. But yeah, like, you'll have stuff that's in cache, for example. But either way, pins tables aren't going to slow things down immensely. So the idea is that, yeah, you would basically have all that. And that's just one of the things that's been on the list of things to do for a long time. But of course, the constant influx of new boards and new devices, and I'm covering 2 new devices today. I put in my stream info that this is Chameleon 3D, the BD sensor, which is the bed distance sensor. This is actually just reads the distance as a value over I squared C, or I2C, however you like to say it. IIC. Well, either way, it reads the data that way, and that's interrupt based, and so you get some better things going on. Let me pull up my channel as usual so that I can manage the keep an eye on chat, and I'll just make a note on. I'm all over the place today. Mail, goodbye. Safari, sure. Sublime Merge, not right now. Messenger, thank you. Yeah, I'm actually on the bed distance sensor contributor has been on. We're in like similar time zones sometimes because they're in China, and yeah, I'm dealing with their stuff coming in, and there was. Oh yeah, one of the things I need to do is bring back Gyre's UI is coming back, but in its previous form before this whole debacle of noise that came through. So yeah, just like, you don't need any of that, man. I got so much to do. Like, I put out this, yes, I put out this tweet about, I'll show you what I've been doing actually. And that's why we're here, to demonstrate things and keep you in the loop. But yeah, I do these things kind of impromptu. Usually, my scheduled one is, of course, tomorrow at 2. So stop by if you haven't stopped by before. Stop by. I always do these streams Saturday at 2, and it's just me hanging out, doing the code. My pretty face on the screen with some ugly code that we're going to fix up. And yeah, so let me go to the old Discordian place here. And we're having a lot of gab lately in dev talk. And there's, a lot of enthusiasm for many different things. Many different things. Enthusiasm for new boards, new devices, and new configuration stuff. So let me go to my LiveStreamo channel. LiveStreamo channel. Check 1, 2. Hey yo, what's up guys? I'm just following mentions, and then there's me on the live stream. Oh hey, someone stopped by. Derek. Hi Derek, what's going on? Good to see you. Yeah, I was just about to look at this config crap, which, it opens up a can of worms, of course, because everyone looks at it and goes, well, why can't I do that, a config file that's on the SD card or someplace, on the printer or whatever. And I can just, edit that, and then I reboot and I don't have to reflash. And I'm like, yeah, of course, There's all kinds of things like that, actually, already. We have auto0.g or whatever, G code. And if you have that on your card, of course, it'll run some M5, you can run whatever commands and set up stuff on that. We just haven't got it set up where it's got like macro names, which would be, that could be interesting. We've already, actually, I have PRs that are sitting around that are about doing macros, but what you have to do is open a file and then run that file without interfering with any other G code, any other things that might be running. So it has to be set up so that we can have I want to make sure that I'm not breaking things, so I've been really reluctant to touch that SD card code. Yeah, auto0g is okay, but it isn't like, yeah, it's like the full capability would be like rep firmware. And of course, as we've been posting on Twitter about this stuff, like, of course, David comes up and's like, well, I won't try to do his voice, because, his attitude is fine. But he's like, yeah, we've had this in rep firmware for a while, and I'm like, well, I'm not suggesting that that even should be in Marlin. I'm just putting it out there and being like, would this particular thing that resembles INI, initialization code be useful to someone in their workflow? I was just sort of like, I know that people use, for example, folders full of config files, and then somehow they probably have a database or have digested the configs in some way. I mean, you can just use diff because that's the convenient format of Git itself. You can always use, something which is just like a script or whatever that changes things or sets the things you want, or you can just scrape them into a database. There's many ways. Yeah, like splitting configuration and doing versioning is like, the cool thing about Git is it does provide you like this whole framework where you can kind of build on top of it. And so it's like you could do versioning in so many different ways, and everyone's like, well, I like Python, and or I like JavaScript. The portability of JavaScript is cool, but it's so obscure in a weird way. Like, you go and you look at it, you're seeing the interface, and then if you want to see the JavaScript behind it, it's not. I don't know. It's like if you're in a shell, the script and the typing of the command for the script are almost side by side, because you can cat the script or less the script or whatever, and you're in this world where it's all unified. If you put a UI on things, it brings that level of separation, and then what's behind it becomes more and more obscure. But of course, in VS Code, I'll bring VS Code up. Boop. So in VS Code, of course, make a UI however you want. This was just meant to be a placeholder, and it's already kind of feeling old. But I wanted to have, it's Marlin 2.1.1, and it shows you by whatever. It scrapes the info out of the config and shows it. And then this idea was to do the same idea, scrape everything, and basically build what you would call a schema. And then that schema becomes the basis for a UI. And of course, if you've seen my demo for the millionth time of like what that looks like, I have this posted. think you had .com/Marlin, and this was like the UI that basically it reads the files from either your local drive or, in this case, I think I just have them in a folder because I was using raw git, but of course you can't use that anymore. So I load these, and then that becomes the basis for the interface. And then when you're changing stuff, it's actually changing the config files. And like, so I was like initially thinking, well, the config files make a good basis for a schema. They are kind of like, if you know how to parse them, they are the schema. But then as things have gotten more complex and we've put more and more blocks, because I wanted to have it say, if you could see that if you had this thing disabled, then this part was, these options don't matter or whatever. Or if you have this thing enabled, then you get these other options. And now the editor actually, will highlight that for you. So as you're editing the config file, you get that whole, things are highlighted or not based on what you have enabled. So you get them dimmed or whatever. I don't know if that's cool or not. It's just one of the things that it does. So as soon as I save that, it should, now it highlights those. So yeah, it's kind of nifty that it does that. If you're editing in here in VS Code, being free, why not edit in VS Code? Everything's right there, including the auto build. So yeah, the idea was to get that or port it over. And actually, I did have this working inside of this for a while, but I didn't want to publish it because it was so broken. Because it could only read old config files. It couldn't read the new ones yet. There was just stuff that it couldn't understand. So I was like, well, I'll just brute force it again and have it parse all the stuff. And I just got halfway into it and got completely sidetracked by the giant pile of pull requests. So I'll get back into it. But this has everything. Like these tooltips are just coming. These are coming straight out of the documentation. So you see that this comment here becomes this comment there. Specify here all the end stop connectors. So it just makes it prettier. And you can hide it with this checkbox here. So yeah, that was the idea. And yeah, I know my face is on top of half of the screen here. But the idea was, yeah, it would collapse to something different as you get to a different size, And the cool thing about this is just that it would be portable, and I made it in JavaScript specifically to be able to run anywhere. Like it's very independent. It has, jQuery in it as a minimized JavaScript, and then it has and then everything is just built with just that. So it's very basic, and it's just like, but of course these tabs here, everything's wide now, so these should be on the left. And I'm really inspired by the interface of like Octoprint, and I think that uses a standard widget set or library for that, Boost or something, not Boost, but something like that. Yeah, some kind of library widget set. So like, building on top of that is a concept, but essentially there's so much complexity. I think you'd see the form itself gets really big. This is just homing, And then the idea was if you saw some setting that had XYZ as its ending or beginning, then I would just make 3 fields and put them on the same line. So it kind of gives it a kind of a cool thing. And of course the other thing is it's scalable. So yeah, that's the other thing about the UIs is they're very scalable. And this does actually have a zip library like JavaScript that just makes a zip. So you can actually download either of these or download a zip of the whole thing. And it just puts a unique name on it as you download it. Each time you roll over it, it changes the name. I don't know, it was fun to make this, but I was learning a lot about, messing with, mainly building forms with jQuery was fun, the fun part. And then of course it scrapes out, how does it know where the boards are? There is actually but yeah, that was the idea. Was I wanted to, nowadays I guess if I was going to do the interface inside of here with auto build, I would have a menu like here. If you wanted to pick a board, it would grab the list of boards would come from GitHub. It would just go right onto GitHub and get the file listing, and just that would present that as the interface. And when you clicked this button, it would maybe bring up, you could either bring up a pop-up menu where you went down by category one at a time or whatever, just 100 different boards or whatever. But I don't know, it'd be nice to have the selector, and in that sense you would put up basically, just upload to GitHub all the things you need. If you needed to show an image of the board, you would upload that to a folder next to your configs. And if you wanted to upload, so you just basically build it all in GitHub, essentially, just a folder structure there. And then you could download that, and if you had a local copy, it would use that instead. So you could avoid, all those having to ping the server. I mean, it's smaller than Wikipedia, and people download that all the time. So, you get the idea. But yeah, every time you need to upgrade from one config to another, the idea would be to have a very simple, I mean, for the longest time we've had SOAP or whatever. There's standard methods to go from, say, one XML that has certain keywords in it to a newer version that has some changes or semantic changes, or even just going from any semantic level to a different semantic level. Like you want to take one chunk and move it up or down in the hierarchy, or you want to change the way that things are arranged. There's standard kind of ways to do these mappings, and so, or you just write a function that does the conversion from one version to another, and if you need to go from one version to 10 versions later, you go, you just do the conversion, and then you do the next conversion, then you just do the one after another until you're done. But the idea is you have to have the configuration in some form that you can use. And Marlin's not going, the configuration of the build is certainly not going away. The configuration of the pieces that are going to be included isn't quite going away. But there are different approaches you can take to that. The only main problem is that if you do any kind of modular, the more you get modular, the more you make things general, the bigger the code starts to bloat. It starts to grow just by the nature of it's not being able to resolve things at compile time as easily. If you can get things to resolve at compile time with clever techniques, use templates a lot, there are a lot of ways you can kind of get away with it, but essentially, like, even if I broke up parts of Marlin into the library folder and had them build as separate .a files and then link those later, the only way to make sure that they're as small as possible would have them all read from the same configuration and build differently for each build. So one thing you could do is, try to split it up into A files and have them build, but then only include the ones that you needed. You could use A, or there are other methods to do it, but typically linking libraries together is one simple way to make things modular. It's also a way you can mix licenses if people want to do that whole LGPL thing for one reason or another. Let them do libraries or whatever. But essentially, the techniques that we're looking for right now are just ways of encapsulating all the, I mean, if we encapsulate the settings that we have now into a form that is like a schema, you can add on to that. Like we can say, well, this command or this value that is a setting also corresponds to this G code and this letter that goes, and that's set with a float. And so you could have all that info in the same structure, and then everything could be associated. And then when you go to spit out the documentation or whatever, you can run that info and spit out a big, set of pages, and Jekyll or whatever is kind of what we're aiming for, is to spit out a bunch of Jekyll and have that spit out, or you can actually just use YAML. You spit out a bunch of YAML, and then that gets ingested by the Jekyll into templates, and then so basically you only have to spit out the YAML part, and you can get the rest out if you just build the templates for it. So essentially, like the G code stuff we have now, which is kind of built by hand, it is still all done in a database YAML kind of structure at this point. It's kind of like typing out a database by hand in a way. But yeah, so building all those pieces and then having the translation, but it's extraordinarily detail oriented because we're talking about not just hundreds but like 1,000 or more settings that we have to deal with. I mean, you can kind of break some of them down into like, oh, it's the same thing just repeated for every axis. Okay, so that helps, but we have to get that. Once we have it ingested, then we can start to look at that and really organize it. But at this point, it has been a very ad hoc process. And that's sort of, where I have to like pause and try to, you know, get a handle on it while it's still handleable. I mean, it is generally handleable. It's just, as you can see, this is a config file and it's over 4,000 lines now. 4,250 lines just for the second one, and the first one is also in the realm of 3,272 lines. So yeah, you're talking about close to 7,500 lines of stuff. So yeah, that's just, and most of that is comments, and, you know, to be fair, but there is a lot of, you know, the thing is that without the comments, it would be hard to make sense of. So one of the other organizational concepts was to just have, like, we have this modules folder now, and there's just sort of like the class that represents the thing. So if you have a filament sensor, it'll have a class for that, and it'll be inside of feature or feature. So now you would say, okay, well, why not put a config file with each feature? And then you take it out of the main config file, and then it just looks to see if it's there. And if it's enabled, then it does the compile. I mean, you can kind of start to build that way, like each feature has its own config file. And then they're all separated into folders. But the problem there becomes, well, then you have to, if you're going to distribute them and have a single config for, you know, for a build or whatever, it's kind of harder to distribute 20 files than it is to distribute one or two, in this case 2, plus some other things. So it's kind of one of the reasons we've just stuck to 2 files, is just easier to package them and to deal with them. And if you have these things sort of, we're still kind of moving around folders and renaming things, and if these things start to move around, it's like, oh, then we have to deal with where the config files go for each thing. So it's just sort of like, it's easier to have it be monolithic again. But yeah, how do you wrangle it? So the idea is really just to make it generative. Like, you have a structure that represents it, a schema that represents it, and yes, the header files are going to be there, but the thing is, you generate them for a while. It's starting with just get it to the point where you can generate the 2 files, and then start to split them up and be like, well, wait, now we can generate them in batches, or we can generate only the pieces that matter, like only the enabled stuff obviously is really what you want. So you could have a simple config that's just like, oh yeah, here, splat. This just has everything that's enabled and everything else is gone. And maybe you could include the commentary with that, so that at least the commentary is there and the enabled stuff, and then you don't worry about necessarily the order. Like, but that's one of the things, is like, you know, when you're dealing with text files, you have to deal with how do you navigate the text file. Excuse me, some noise from back here again. This place, I tell you. Oh, get that up there. I wonder if they do this on purpose, man. No. The only conspiracy is that my ears work. Hold on a sec. I'll do this properly. And we're back. Yeah, it's still pretty bad. It's just the plumbing makes noise. Okay, so when you look at this, it's like, hey, did you know there's a maglev probe by MDD? Yeah, it's here. It's right in the middle, 1,300 lines down in the file. Like, you know, it's the discoverability of this is one of the issues. It's like, how do you find things? So by putting it into a UI, it makes things easier to find. But I think that so far the UIs have been a little bit lacking. I think it would be nice if it was just down the left side, like all the you just have the tabs. Hey, Pull3D, what's up? Good to see you. Yeah, you just have like all the things on the side, and then if you were looking for a probe, you would just click probes, and then you would see a list of all the probes, and you'd be like, oh, there's a thing called the MDD. What's that? And you could click on it, and it would show you a link, and maybe some images, and, you know, maybe even a link to a video or something. Who knows? And it can all be embedded in there. So I'm really anxious to, you know, get these things built out so that it can be that discoverable. And there are hints in here like that I put in, like at symbol section or whatever with a name, so that it could kind of self-organize. And then again, this being sort of the initial source for the schema, build it out from that. So right now I've got it, so let me show you what I did build out, as long as we're talking about this. I am working on the release of it, so I'm like, why am I streaming and trying to do release at the same time? Why not? It's more, it gets my brain going. It's like white noise for baboons. Is that a thing? Yes, it is. Ask Kyle. He knows. So, what are we looking for? Oh, right. Marlin bug fix. There's a thing called config.ini, right? And the idea of this was that, here's Marlin. Config.ini, it's called. So here you would have just, this is a dump of, this is based on a dump. How do you do a dump? Let me see. Well, the first thing is I actually set it up to do this. Like I put a little section in here. Actually, they're going to start renaming these. Config. We'll just call this config. Sure. Config base. We'll call it. Config hidden. Config basic and config advanced. How about that? Just so that they have distinctive names. It was requested. So right now, this is just going to look for, well, here's how it all works. Configuration.py. So there's some Python for you Python lovers. I know there's a lot of you out there. So how does this work? Well, I don't seem to be navigating with the sidebar much, so let's move over. Yeah. So this just uses, this is how the thing that parses config.ini, and it is called in.py. I'll just show you where it's added. Common. So if you're a PlatformIO and a fan, as I am lately, it certainly saves us an awful lot of work. You have a common section that applies to all most Marlin builds. I guess there's a couple that maybe don't use this. So probably more than a couple. But this includes the scripts that you're going to run at the start of the build. And those are marked with pre. And so the very first one that it does ahead of anything else is this one, where it looks, by the time you get to this point, it actually, PlatformIO has already made it possible so you can ingest files and do all kinds of clever things. So I'm actually using this thing called project config from PlatformIO, along with regular expression, OS, and subprocess, which I don't think I'm even using subprocess, so we can leave that out. Am I using OS? I probably am, but yes, okay. So anyway, definitely RE. So what this is basically able to do is just read any ini file, and it'll give you as you read through it, it'll give you a little set of items. One, the first index, it gives you two at a time, so it gives you this, and then it gives you this. And I think if you put a bunch of things with commas, it'll give you a list. So if I say base, hello, etc., each of these will be handed to me in Python as a list of strings, I think, is what it ends up being. But the whole thing is handed to you as a string, so like if I have this as a setting, it actually just gives me this literally, so it's not like it's trying to parse it beyond anything besides looking for an equal sign and splitting things on the equal sign. So the configuration just has to parse that, and in order to, and what it does with it is it actually uses this to modify the configuration files. So quite simple. It's a pretty simple idea, which just kind of like came to me in a dream. I woke up and I was like, why don't I do that? Because it's stupid. I've been talking about, this sort of thing, and we actually have a lot of it is partially done. There's a pull request that includes some of this idea in it, just the initial inspiration. But I just wanted to also play with Python and get used to it, because you might have seen the other day when I was playing with, here it is here, when I was using the Copilot, it was teaching me how to write code that in languages I didn't understand quite so well. And but it wasn't always right. It was more of doing a clever imitation sometimes. So I pulled it in to try to help me with this, and it did actually produce some helpful code while I was doing it. So that was a fun project. But yeah, go back to here. But there's this, and then there's also a thing called signature, which is run as part of the build, and the purpose of this script is to make a copy of your configuration and zip it up and put it into the build as data so that you can spit it out as a file later, and get your settings back, basically, that were used to do the build of Marlin. Now, this is great, but it is part of that beating a dead horse thing where we're still hung up on this same that this way of doing the configuration is, well, it's not so much hung up on it because it is producing a JSON blob. It's just that we're still going back to the config files, and they're still becoming they're just a painful pile of files sometimes to deal with. So yeah, at the moment, this basically, I added this blob of code here and this thing called tryint because I've been doing this a lot. And then a thing called, did I do opt set? No, everything else here was already there. So, but it's part of compute build signature. It extracts the defines, and you can see here, it extracts the defines and the config headers to build a unique reversible signature. So it can be included in the binary, and then you get out basically the config, and there's a script that'll apply it back to the configurations, I'm pretty sure. The idea here was to make it part of the build so that you could throw it into this. If you had this file in there, you just use this, and then it just automatically applies it. It's kind of a shortcut, because I was like, well, we're already doing INI files, and it's like, well, what if the INI file told it to change the configs? And so initially what I did was I had to just dump these out, whatever their settings were, all uppercase and whatever. And the way that those are gotten out by the signature file is pretty clever, because it just does, it calls this thing called preprocess, I want to say. Let's find preprocess. I think it's actually in a script called preprocessor, yeah. So all this does is just invokes GCC, and it's a local copy or whatever one it can find. It runs whatever GCC it can find, and it passes certain flags to it, and in doing so, we're guaranteed to have a GCC, because we know that you're doing a build, so there's a GCC somewhere. So yeah, it passes DM-DM, and that gives us basically all the defines that are defined up to a certain point. And the only thing we include is we run it with, I want to say, is it just common dependencies.h? Maybe, because you don't have to necessarily do a CPP file. But yeah, so it does run that, and then it gives us all the defines out, and from that we can then look at the configs and check output as kind of how it's done of a shell command, split lines, this command, which command? Oh, this is the actual thing, and then we get the output back, because it just prints out the define list as a big old, cache list, basically. And then that gets further dealt with later. So in our case, it runs it for the signature part, gets us back the config, and if it's already cached, we don't have to do it again, which is good. You only want to run it once if you can help it. And then you get the complete config from that, and then just basically go through it. And in this case, it does the build signature from that, cleverly extracts it out as key value pairs. And the purpose initially was to use it for the JSON and then zipping it up. So I was like, well, we've got that now. So I'll add an option called config dump, and if it's in the configurations, we'll do a dump, and it'll look like something like this. And then initially, well, you can see what it looks like. I'll show you when I do the build with the dump in it. It's like, so if, right now, because configuration is in there, if I run this, it'll run base, but actually I need to change it because I just did the little tweaking. So let's look for, it's looking for a thing called Marlin, and we'll call that config base. And then this one is config basic and config advanced. So that should all work. Oh, and then here, yeah, config base again. Base, there. That'll be better. I was just trying to come up with unique names, but yeah, you'd want to keep them in their own sort of namespace, so this will work. Okay, I hope. Let's save those real quick. Goes there, and that's my base config, which I'm using for dumping. Oop, all right, staying organized, kids. Stay organized a little bit. Okay, so now if I do a build of just the base configs, oops, something weird happened. What did I do? Oh, I've got empty configs right now, so it doesn't like to build them at all. I think I have to take out the hidden part, and then it should work. Huh. Yeah, it's been tested, so. So what did it produce? Well, if I go to where the build is, I now have a config.ini file there. And if I open that up in Sublime, there it is. I'll have to have it change how it spits things out, but right now it's these are all the options, and it basically put them in lowercase because I don't know. For ini files, they kind of look better. I could do them all in uppercase, but I don't know. What do you think? Maybe I'll do it as an option. What do you think? Yeah? Big, small, I don't know. It takes them all. There we go. Yeah, so I don't know. I like lowercase. I just find it a little more readable, more separated. Just gives more a little more breathing room. Depends on your font, I guess. I could put it into like some kind of nice italic font. That would work pretty well. Okay. So yeah, that's pretty neat. So then yeah, if you just copy this and use it later, that's your entire config. It'll work in here. So that's just one way to do it. And yeah, you can see it only dumps out the minimum like stuff. Like this is everything that's enabled. And because I started with a minimal config, like I went back and I started with minimum config and then I said build, and then it was like I went through each complaint and I was like, oh, you need that? Okay, you need that, you need that. And so this represents this particular config.ini that I have here. It represents the absolute minimum that you need to build. Although I did turn on one extruder, and so that matters. And then I also turned on PID temp. So with those two could both be turned to 0, and it would be less things required. Also, because I did X, Y, and Z drivers, and there's 3 regular axes, you could actually leave out Y and Z now. You only need 1 axis in Marlin, so it could be even more minimal, super minimal. But that's the cool thing, is it's more, I just think it's a little more portable, and also it takes what was 2 files and puts it in 1 file, so it's a little more neat. And because of the way it works, like if there's something that it doesn't recognize, I'll show you what happens actually. If it doesn't recognize something, like right now, this is a very minimal config file. You'll never see one with as much gray in it as this one is showing. Like normally, maybe I should use this because it makes for nicer scrolling. But yeah, you can see there's very, very minimal, super minimal. But yeah, like if it doesn't recognize something, so let's put in, oops, sorry, config.ini, the actual one it's using, please. So let's take the, I don't need to change it anymore, and I could take out this config dump if I want, but let's put in something unknown option equals 10, you know, 2 equals 100, I don't know. But yeah, if I run the builds now, when I come back to here, GitHub desktop, I guess, and look at it, sorry about that, it's behaving again. You'll see it adds them up at the top and labels them added by configuration.py. Maybe I should say config.ini, would that be smarter? Something like that. So yeah, so it just sticks them at the top. Basically, it looks for the first define line, and then it puts, and then it looks for the last one after it, and then it adds a new line right below. So each time it'll say, oh, I'll put it right below here. Usually it'll find this, and it'll put it there, and then the next time it'll put it right there. So that works out, as long as there's a configuration version in there. Should be. If the next thing it would find would be down below it, which would be somewhere down here, and so yeah, it could end up adding it right after like show boot screen or something like that. Or maybe I should look for a disabled define as well, just in case. But yeah, so right now that's all it does. That's the neat trick it does. So simple, you know, nothing too weird about it. Just does what it's supposed to do. And that's pretty neat. So yeah, the total minimal blank configuration is like, I had to go through and like, I did this in the right order, I think. Start with everyone that's disabled already with 2 slashes in front of it. Put 2 more spaces after the name of the thing, because when you put the 2 slashes in front of the other things, the whole line is going to get pushed over. So, but if there's nothing at the end of the line, of course, obviously you don't need to add the spaces there. But yeah, that was the idea. And then after those 2, then you do one more pass to make sure any like end of line comments that are supposed to be lining up with things are also moved over by 2. So basically everything moves over 2, but it allows you to disable it without changing the formatting. So yeah, it was a quick trick to avoid having to do any like reformatting by hand. Although I did have to go through and like find ones where it was like, what was the point of this one? There's no reason to do this one. So I would go back and take that out. Be like, you know, that spacing is fine. I don't have to change this one, right? So there's a few that are just like superfluous, but that's the idea. It was just as quickly as possible, keep everything aligned, and then deal with the anomalies later. Which I thought I had, but I guess no. Hide the white space changes, and then all my sins are forgiven. You won't even notice. But yeah, that's basically the idea. Disable everything, including like sub options that might be required, just to see what the build would do, like, and see, oh, I forgot to put in a sanity check for this, or you can you sanity check everything? Again, that was the idea, and for a while it made sense, because if you build with Arduino IDE, like, you don't get any of this. So you need some method for it to be able to tell you that, you know, the configuration is not right and how to fix it. That was the idea, or how to upgrade it. And actually, that is one thing that is there, you know, and it's the worst way possible is, yeah, you take the old config and try to build with it and see what happens. Oh well. Let's make sure I've got my voice on live stream here. Oh, yeah, I've got a pretty good audio feed coming back to me. Okay, so yeah, this is a little neater, and I'll upload those. And yeah, that's the parse for settings. Neater, please. And yeah, I could even put in like the section that it comes from instead of, I could add to that comment. So say, oh, it came from this section of config.ini. Sure, why not? But yeah, the signature part is the part that actually does the dump, and it's amazingly small. When it came down to it, like it took me a while to like arrive at something fairly small, but this part with the initial hash, actually, I would have missed if the Copilot hadn't thrown it in there for me. These particular 2 lines, I was like, oh, initial hash, is that a standard thing? And I noticed, oh no, it adds it up here. Copilot noticed that before I did. So yeah, it's pretty smart sometimes. And then this writing the binary file with a lot of B's on things, I didn't realize that was a thing. I had started, so it taught me that. And that was just because it's write binary. But yeah, and all it does is just goes through the keys and writes them out, and then it does a little clever formatting of it. It writes it out with 40 columns. Turned out to 40 columns because some of these options are that long. Ridiculous, but oh well. But it shows also, I also wanted to do some shorthand, like if you, instead of specifying LCD equals, a particular LCD name equals on, you could say LCD equals this thing, and it would translate that for you into the right thing. So there's a couple of cases where it'll say, oh, well, if you said LCD, it'll actually assume the name is the value, and then the value is on, so it swaps it around for you. So that was one idea, was to have it do that for you. But that's kind of one useful idea. And then, yeah, if something is on or off, and then how do you deal with off? Take define and replace it, put 2 slashes in front of it. But wait, if there's already 2 slashes in front of it, then remove them. Yeah, stupid shit like that. For options with values, enable and set the value. So this was fun. Was just like how do you go through a file and change, set things based on something else, and then at the end. So this little process here is pretty cool. If you're into your Python, first you have to compile a regular expression to get all the bits. So it took me a while to arrive at this one. So this was certainly not a brainstorm, but I had most of it in my head initially. So it was like, okay, I can get pieces of it, and then I'll just start to see where it's falling apart. So little by little, I realized I'd have to put 2 slashes here or 2 slashes there, an extra, look for a space here, swallow those here, put a question mark so it's not greedy there, even though that doesn't really matter. It seems like this whole thing could be one piece, really. But when it came down to it, I was like, well, let's pick out the pieces. And little by little, I did arrive at sort of stuff like this, where it was like, well, how do I align the comments so it doesn't screw up the file too much? And also I wanted it so that if you ran it twice, it wouldn't continuously be making things shift around each time more and more or whatever. And I think I've accomplished most of that. Most options in here end up being on or off, but there's a lot of values, and the values themselves, you can refer to earlier ones. It's still using capitalization here. I didn't automatically like assume, like because of things like this, short name with an A, and most of it's a number. Like, should I capitalize this automatically if it's lowercase? Like, I have to pick that. So I was like, I just had to pick and choose. So things like this. If it has an underscore in it, maybe I would assume. But what I ended up doing was like just doing no case matching. Like just like, oh, okay, if it's close enough. Like if it's x home dir with a capital D or whatever, if you did it this way, it would all still work. That would work fine. But, it doesn't do any kind of camel case change for you. Like it won't do x bed size turns into x underscore bed underscore size or anything like that. You could do those kinds of transformations for fun, but it should be consistent, I think. So yeah, I started grouping them, and I was like, well, should I keep x together and y together and z together? And it didn't seem to matter much, Just like, whatever. Home direction, bed size. I'm pretty sure there's a z max pause. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so this kind of stuff was just like, let's just be literal and see what happens. And I was shocked, actually, that it all worked as quickly as it did. Like, oh, okay, it just works. And I could do some things like, again, the cool thing about this is you could say, well, if I wanted to make a preheat one, like one of the things I did kind of want to do would be to like have it be, I want to be able to say, like make a structure where it's just like fan speed colon like that, and then like, and then it would automatically generate the right things for the config by looking at this inside, like have an extra option like that. So that's one kind of idea I was thinking would maybe be okay. Like, yeah, let's keep the ability to have this, but then if you had things that were longer or whatever, it would be good. So yeah, and then we never did use preheat 2 here, so it didn't seem to matter. And I guess the preheat temperature is used always, but then the other stuff isn't unless you have to put a title on it for it to become a menu item, I guess. Interesting. A label on it. Yeah, and then if you don't have a label, it doesn't count. It doesn't count. So yeah, this kind of stuff was fun to play around with. Like all these other options were actually part of the default, which weren't really needed necessarily for, you know, just for a successful build. The rest of the stuff that's in here was like, well, this is stuff you probably want to use for a common firmware, and it was originally set up for Ultimaker, and then little by little it's been massaged, like, oh well, we probably want to have this, and we'll probably want to have that, and little by little decided, you know, what things to keep and not keep. And then the other question is like, what are the actual defaults anyway? Like if you do leave these things out, some of these might be turned on later, and like, how do you know? So should be throwing warnings for that sort of stuff more. You have to watch for that kind of thing. Like there's a lot of conditional defines, but we try not to like automatically turn an option on. Instead, we just prompt the user to turn it on. So you know that you should just, and it'll be in the config. So we try to keep things in the config, but yeah, this kind of thing. Config H author, like, okay, you throw that up here. Put it up here, hit config.ini. So stuff like that is fun. And then this would be whatever. But yeah, I like the just having the ability, because it's nice to have. Even if it doesn't build, at least you can do like, oh, I just want to do this one mod. Test it. There it is. It works. So move on. But you see here, I did actually seem to manage I managed to keep the spacing here. Not with this one. It was just like, who cares? So yeah, I don't know. Preserving spacing is worth it, but it's fun to try. So yeah, interesting stuff. But yeah, by putting I ended up putting the hidden in here just so I could upload it and not mess up the CI. Like it won't change anything except like it'll just run config dump. It'll stick config dump in there. So I know config dump works on the CI now for anything that runs this script, which is everything pretty much. There may be other cases where, like, I should check it out anyway and see. Let's see, where is common dependencies stuck on? Any place else? Nope. So yeah, it looks like maybe common is used everywhere pretty much. So that's good. Pre-flight checks was another area I was a little concerned about. I was like, well, I want to make sure I do this ahead of pre-flight checks for sure. So initially I just had it there, but then I was like, well, wait a minute. I should really go way up to the top and have it even run for common dependencies, because that matters. Like this is where it decides what features to pull in, what files will actually be included in the build. So you have to do this at first. So I was like, oh, I win. I get to make the very first script. So this is a cool, I don't know, this is going to be cool. I'm really looking forward to having this, but just because it's whatever, it's going to be useful for the next step, which is, it certainly was fun to get the dump part out. So now I have this doing the actual dump. It's like, well, okay, now what about having it look for let's have it look for the other stuff, look for the comments around each option and start to pull those in and maybe I'll get good at Python finally, and then I'll have to decide what to do with all that JavaScript. But as long as it's built and working, I mean, that's the important thing. A schema, and then we can actually start to use that to generate stuff, new files, other files. And to archive the configs as well is a big deal. Like I've got SQL in my brain, but it's like I set out to do a little bit of a Drupal interface, but my site is all broken. It's Drupal 6, which is fine, but I think some of my add-ons are just not all there. And they're probably, the server I'm on is probably gone like many generations further in PHP, so things may just be broken. So I have to upgrade my site, and meanwhile, away from probably Drupal altogether, or maybe just go for the final. I don't know, what are they up to, 8 or 9 now? It's been, I think the development's slowed to a halt, but there are other things you can build sites with, right? But yeah, building a database interface. So there's been some looking at other options. There's sort of agile type solutions, and those look pretty cool. So I'm gonna wait to see how those pan out, and see what, as far as this kind of stuff. Yes, you could definitely spit out SQL, for example, instead of instead of an INI file. You could just very quickly just say, insert into blah, name equals blah, value equals blah, and just let it be all strings or whatever. And decide later on, types, label it with a type, and then let your script deal with converting it from a string to whatever type it says it is. Like, this XY probe free rate, we may say it's an integer, but what's wrong with an expression? Nothing. So yeah, let it be an expression. We won't try to evaluate it, so let it be a string, essentially. Like, just stick it in there. The only thing we could enforce, I wouldn't even want to necessarily enforce things. Like, that's the thing with the, I think the field, you just let it be editable, and you parse it however you want. But yeah, that's the thing about web interfaces and so forth. But yeah, the general idea would be to, of course, also be able to group a lot of these things together and say, well, if you're using this, then you're probably going to change this to that, and that to this, and this other thing to that. And so you probably want these 7 things. And so not just one config.ini file, but several. And then the other idea also would be, well, let's just look for anything that starts with config:, and we'll just run that, and we'll take note of whether it's, if it happens to be advanced, we'll put it in the second file, or assume that it goes in the second file. If it's basic, it goes in the first file. Basic, I don't know what else to call it. And if it's, hidden, well, it's hidden, shouldn't be, I guess it should not be parsed. I would call this something else then. I would take the config off of it. Hidden: hidden. But yeah, that's the idea. And then you have a section for each thing, and you could turn the whole thing on or off inside the thing or whatever. I don't know. There's different ways to approach it. Obviously, once you have a structure, it's like you can just play around with it. This isn't much of a structure. It's, at most, you could call it 2-level because it has the concept of sections and then sub-items, but that's it. It's got 1 level of complexity, and then the values become whatever. So, disable inactive. Like, there's a good case where you'd want to have, like, disable inactive, and you could say E:, maybe there's a format I could come up with, E:, true, X:, true, whatever, that kind of idea. But yeah, you would do something silly like this. And it would stick it on the end. Disable inactive, E, X, Y, Z. But yeah, we did stick the word true in there. I wonder if that, I guess that evaluates to just the string again. It's just the choice of this particular parser for INI that is chosen to do that. Reg. Yeah, I don't know what that means. editor config. Yeah, so moving on. Yeah, so this is the dump, and the only thing I could think to do with the dump was to first break it into sections and then just alphabetize. Because yeah, without alphabetizing, it was not really in any kind of order. It was really weird. For example, yeah, I can even show you that. Like, here's the signature, and you can see it does a sorted data header. So if I take out the sorted and then just do the dump, we'll call that. Now you get a config that looks like this. Like, look at it. Ooh, well, it's like no order. Well, there's a couple of things that are in order. But yeah, starting out with Y driver type, preheat, temp, and like these driver types should be together at the least. So I'm not sure what the order is about. There may be some way I can preserve the order from the configuration, but at the moment it's a bit of a mess. So just decided to sort them. It works out better. And yeah, when you do that, should be better if I ever get it. Oh, you know, I may have not have generated it that time. Do it twice. There we go. Yeah, so I don't know. Slightly neater. So yeah, the idea there is now I guess we just have to alphabetize things more. Think about how they'll alphabetize. But yeah, so many things start with X, Y, Z. So you things end up just grouping anyway. There's all your X stuff. There's all your Y stuff. And your Z stuff. Another thing we want to hoping, and also as you look at this, you're like, well, why do you still have use xmin, ymin plug? Why are these still there? I think it was because we didn't have good cues for which end stops would be available. Now we could probably, we have this pins post process header, and we could probably do more of dealing with those in there. That's something that I would look at. But yeah, like right now, it's just we didn't have great cues for knowing which ones to use for like what we're going to use connect your probe to, for example, and that you were going to use this particular plug. But then we would say, well, you're not using that plug, so let's undefine this pin. So we just had to have a thing to say, well, guard this plug. I am using it for sure. And so it was just a way of ensuring that things were enabled when they needed to be enabled. So if there's a way we can figure this out, we can get rid of these, that'd be neat. Keep it in mind. It's not like, I don't know that we're actually compiling any code in for them. I think it has to do with, well, it does have to do with how end stops are applied, so I don't know. The only other thing about this is if you go like to do a search for this, like you have to do case insensitive searches to find the things, but hey, they're cheaper, right? Or are they? No, actually case sensitive searches are cheaper. But yeah, here you can see if you home to min, you have to enable it. The use xmin plug probably for this case. So yeah, there's just like, I'm sure there's a way we could work this out. If not defined and stop is in use, see here we actually do enable it for you. So there are cases where these things are enabled for you. Stop in use, and how is it? X2 uses, Y2 uses, Z2 use, Z3 use, Z4 use. So these, so there may be ways we could figure it out, and then get rid of all that rigmarole where you have to do it yourself. I don't know. So many details, right? But yeah, the big rigmarole on Twitter and everywhere else is, yeah, can we make pins into variables? And yeah, there's a way to do that. Excuse me. Right now, the way that pins work is you use a thing called fast.io. So here's a fast I/O header to give you an example. It just includes one of the right ones for the architecture you're on. But you can see that these are, it's all done with macros. So the pin you name, so let's say this pin number IO, it takes DIO and puts IO, your number, and then puts R port, and then it does this. So when you were going to read a pin, you're actually doing a bit test of the particular pin number, DIO, IO pin, on a particular port, DIO pin number port. So you'll end up with something like, say you were doing pin 7 or whatever, you end up with something like this. So you're just reading it that way. So that is hard coded. Now what we would do instead is, for a variable one, you would define this. If you were going to follow this same pattern, you would do something like test pin port, IO, and maybe you do, and then whatever it would be, pin bit, yes, and the same thing, you'd have IO like that. And that would be one way you would do it. Another way might be to do pin, and you would have like this, IO read, and just let the, or even this, depending how you set it up. But yeah, you would basically have a template class that did that. So you might do it like that, for example, and then it would just basically generate the class in place, and it would already have, and that info would be there. And if it was a variable, it would, well, that would actually be that would still be constant, wouldn't it? Yes, the way I was basically saying it would be something like that. Or you may do something along those lines where you have them be objects. There's all kinds of approaches you could take. So we kind of just have to pick one that we like. But for them to be variables, you would have it basically also be, instead of doing a read on the pin number, you would be reading something, say, based on its function, rather than, having the pin be variable. You would have it be based on some kind of like, well, when we're reading the filament sensor, we know that that's an index number 77, and we just have a table built, and we know that, and that should be, nothing that's predefined. It should shift around as you add or remove functions. The table should change in size, and however many pins it's going to hold, it can change. That's fine. But yeah, you would basically have it something along those lines. So if you had that, instead of using IO, you would say, function. So say, like, basically the way we'd do it would be, you would replace the idea of the pin number with that pin now being like more of an alias for the function. So when you say filament sensor pin, like for example, sensor pin, let's say, or fill, I think it's actually called fill sensor pin, something like that. Fill sensor, I don't know, hello. It's been a while, but yeah, so you can see there's many references to it, as you'd expect. But yeah, you would basically do it like filament sensor pin itself would actually end up being something like an object reference, more like, so you might have pin, filament sensor pin, dot, whatever. And its unique number would really just be more of just a unique identifier than anything else, which would just make it behave differently depending on, well, it would be part of a class. Situation, and then its actual number, like you would have something like, set pin, and then it would actually be able to do, not for read, of course, maybe init, pin, whatever, pin, and then you could say something like, pin object, just for fun, or, I guess for templates you might say something like pin t or t pin. But yeah, there's different ways you could approach that. And then you would basically have this just be, filament sensor pin could be whatever. It could be a structure which contains all the info about the pin, for example, and then that info would end up being, embedded in the temporary object that you have while you're doing pin manipulation, which just basically has, what are you going to do with it? Typically, we might do something like that, and then you would say, since it would be, well, in this case, you would have it be a persistent object, I guess. So yeah, you'd have to have something along those lines where, who knows, maybe filament sensor pin is actually an alias for the pin itself. So that way it can just be an object. So, but in order to, again, in order to be able to still use the same system we use now, where we have things which are numbered, and those pin numbers actually do correspond to, I believe they actually really do correspond just to numbers, basically. So like if you look at AVR treats them like, like they're going to be literal numbers, and then it uses this lookup table stuff. So if I look at FastIO, like these are really long files, but you see there's a 1281 and it has all these macros defined, every single one that you would need to be able to know to talk to 47 pin, so-called pin 47 is actually, it's actually pin F1 with, on R port, read port pin F, and write port port F, and, and other things, DDR, DDRF, PWM, nope. So yeah, each of these things has all that stuff associated with it. And some of these PWMs do have a thing. And so just because some of them might, you have to make one for all of them. So this is, sort of the messiest version of FastIO you could imagine, I guess. But we decided on mappings, to make sure that everything works the way it's supposed to. And then there's certain clever mappings like, the teensy Duino, like these pins 46 and 47, E2 and E3, I guess. And so yeah, these had to be sort of shunted in there. So those little weird things we have to consider going to any kind of variable idea. But if you limit the variable idea to just, say, STM32 processors and forget about the rest for the time being, its FastIO is very small because it consists of, using sort of the built-in functions already. And so it doesn't matter if these IOs are variable or not. And so you can still use the same write and the same read and all that, and except you'll be using these. So you could get the same thing out of the others. All you do is just change everything to digital read, digital write, and throw out all the fanciness and just have it use the IO as the direct pin number. You just have to make sure that the mapping is right, that you really are using those numbers. Like the idea of FastIO is it's supposed to map one-to-one with the Arduino stuff. So, cross your fingers. There are a couple places like the extended Mega 2560 stuff where it wouldn't necessarily work, probably, possibly. Probably. You'd have to do some special case for that. But with STM32, set input actually just goes to set mode. Set mode calls pin mode. It's a function. Like, I don't know if there's any place, let's see, toggle. Toggle actually does do a toggle bit, but it does it, yeah, so this actually is doing stuff, but it is doing, digital pin to pin name stuff. So again, it looks to me like, yeah, an STM port ends up going to, I don't know where. Not sure where that's defined. Maybe it's not part of our stuff. So it comes from STM32 stuff. And then there's this whole FastIO port map everything. I think that's in here. Yeah, and it gets initialized with digital pin sub I STM port get GPIO port. So it actually, is using, again, it is variable. So the question then would be, you have to do one level of indirection basically to turn STM32's fast IO into something a little more configurable. Not necessarily indirection, but the pins throughout the code would have to bear some level of indirection. So basically, currently they're all defined in pin files and then used pretty much directly in the read and write functions with the pin names. And so it's a question of how then what do you do with that pin name? What do you do with it from that point? What does it become? The thing is, if you've got a one-to-one lookup table, then it can become the index instead of the pin, and you're all good. So that can work fine as long as you have that one-to-one lookup table, and then you just change the thing to an indirection. So here I might do a prototype real soon because I want to kind of explore that concept. The thing is just which codes are used to set the pins, and then how do you get them all initialized initially, make sure they're all initialized correctly. But yeah, and then how much do you need? How much do you need out of your pin library? I know there's probably lots of examples online I could check out as well, as far as which things do what. Let's pull up one of them just real quick. Fast IO C++, I don't know, variable pins, I guess. I guess you can't do fast IO with, that's the thing, is it's fast IO is with variable pins is the opposite of what that is. Let me see, fast IO for Arduino. There's a thing called fast digital IO. Recognizes, so you have I'm just sort of zipping through the article. I don't know if I want to bore you guys with it, but I'll bring it over. So yeah, using the fast IO stuff trick. Yeah, you see this is the kind of performance you get. 3 times faster basically. Using fast IO as opposed to variable pins or any kind of use of the built-in functions. However, fast IO in Marlin for STM32 is pretty much, except for the write, you can see it's like, if it's a write it does this, if it's with a high it does this, if it's a low it does this, BSRR setting, and then BRR. So yeah, just basically it sets by doing that, and then for these ones, and then for the others it does a write using this method. Same thing basically. BSRR equals, and then it does an either adds 0 or 16 to get the bit that it's going to change. So one of them is a write, and one of them changes it to low, and one of them changes it to high. Interesting. So yeah, you still write high in both cases, but different bit depending on what you want to do. Yeah, and then read kind of does the same kind of idea. This is again digital pin to pin name IO. So that would be where the indirection would come in here. I think we would add some kind of indirection in this, right in that spot. Instead of doing IO would be a lookup table instead of the pin name. So right now these macros are calling it directly, and I guess we don't define it, do we? Ourselves? No. Nope, that's part of the framework. So yeah, we can totally do an indirect thing called, instead of digital pin to pin name, we would do like a digital pin index to pin name or something like that. Digital index or yeah, pin index to pin name. If that can work for all cases, that would be pretty neat, because it looks to me like name. So-called name is kind of the thing that it considers to be the most important thing. Although that could be a macro as well. I'll have to look that up. Where is it defined? Show me. I guess Visual Studio Code can tell me. Better than anything else. Right, so here's an example. Go to definition, please. What? No definition found. Darn. Darn. Have to be in the right one, I guess. Probably helps. Yeah, so that configuration thing, I don't know. We'll see how it works out. It's fun to play with, I gotta say. I enjoy using it to like instantly modify a config without having to dig around in the config and find the option. That's kind of maybe its main advantage, is just you just stick it in there and it mods the config for you, which, hey, that's great. That turns out to be pretty neat. Keep the hidden. Dump. I guess. Oops. I guess I'll not change that. Let's throw these away. All right. Keep that. Let's see. Was that the one? Was that the one that I wanted to use? No. Let's see where I've got a config.ini. Oh, I did put one there. Okay. Well, I feel like that has to be reversed. Let's just take that out for the moment. For now, I have a feeling that config prefix doesn't necessarily need to be there. Key. And yeah, test one. And that seemed to work. Let's see. Config base. What do you know? Okay, and then I did a dump, which is kind of what you want. Okay, cool. Oops. Yeah, I can't actually upload that part yet. Let's go with head 2, I guess. Sometimes you gotta go back. So yeah, this is the same idea here. Just use the fast I/O, just comparing the difference. Yeah, see this kind of stuff. Yes, you can do all that. And then down here, I think, let's see how they ended up doing it. Yeah, I think they ended up using the macro method, pretty much. Port right. define port right value equals 0, port and equals 1 shift left. So yeah, if you know the port, I mean, if you know the names and stuff, you can just do it that way. That's a kind of a shortcut for you. But yeah, this is, of course, if you want to generalize, make it variable. You're going to slow things down a little, but at least you get that flexibility. So the next question becomes like, what are the probably many G-codes that are associated with setting pins for, say, RepRap firmware? And of course, when you adopt those G-codes, they come with other word letters that you have to then deal with, probably implementing as well, or at least considering for future expansion. But if I go to the reprap.org wiki, go to the G-code page, here we are. This is where it all happens. So like set pin, let's just look for the word set pin. Pin. M42, that's how we do everything in Marlin, M42 baby. Let's see what kind of, we've got here. Set IO port bit mapping, M670. Let's see what this does. List of logical port numbers, port switching time in advance. So this is a different thing. IO ports. Neat. Don't know what kind of stuff that's used for, but I'll check it out sometime. So yeah, a lot of the stuff, it does center around RepRap firmware. So you have to look around for, there's a whole page of there's particular codes, which I think is linked at the top of this page somewhere. If not, I'll add it. Should be linked somewhere in here, because yeah, it's got more going on. Actually, I can just do a search up here too. RepRap firmware. Check that out. There they are, G-codes. It's got its own page for this. So yeah, so default values macros. So we've been working on some macro stuff. It is hanging around. It's just not done yet. Wait until end stop is triggered, you know, M577. Things like that could be certainly dealt with. You know, any of these for, you know, just for compatibility, they could be filled in. I don't know why a lot of this stuff isn't, but it's, you know, all these things are weekend projects, right? There's only so many weekends. So many of me, and sometimes my shoulders hurt. I can get away with a day off sometimes, come on. Some set compatibility. So you got some G-code style compatibility stuff. Z-probe type. So that would be an example of having to have compiled in various Z-probe types all ready to go. Or at some, you know, more primitive level, and have some ideas of, you know, how to modify behaviors based on those primitives. Set drive mapping was handled by M569, but so I guess we don't have to do that code. We can now just do M584 instead, which I guess is linked up here somewhere. M584, please. There it is, set drive mapping. Yeah, so driver numbers for X motors. So yeah, you have to probably do a lower level where you set the actual pins for the drivers first. And so this is a case where, you know, the kinds of things you would do with Marlin wouldn't, you know, once you've installed it on a printer, for example, most of the things you'll want to modify are things like maybe your bed size, you know, got a little, because you put a new bed on there maybe, or made it a little bigger, figuring out ways to make your axis longer, whatever. You'll want to change things like your, maybe your probe, turn it on or off, like have some kind of basic probe support in there, like maybe you know you're going to put a BL touch on there and have that ability to turn it on or off. Or maybe it's a standard option of some kind with your, you know, commercial printer. Who knows? But somewhere you just have it all already compiled in. But yeah, all this kind of stuff has to be, in there in some form. And it's like, when I love David, but coming along and like saying, well, we've had this or that. It's like, yeah, well, you were built from the ground up with that, so to speak, as the whole idea um, was that you would have a monolithic firmware, and then with everything all built into it. And if you wanted to be a Delta, you could be a Delta, and you just change the configuration files on the disk, and then no one would ever need to upgrade to the next version of RepRap firmware ever again, and flash another firmware on their board. In practice, people do end up doing a lot of firmware on their board, but the bootloader makes it easier, and being able to do it through a web interface makes it easier. So a lot of that good stuff makes it much the user experience better for that kind of thing. And then having the standard web interface and so forth to be able to manage your various files that you do manage on there and so forth. It's like if you're going to have a set of INI files or a set of macros on an SD card, you really want to have the printer be able to deal with those and have an interface to deal with those on the printer while you're, making those edits, so you don't have to keep taking the card in and out, especially some printers that slots are hard to work with, tiny cards. So when you're dealing with, the kinds of printers that we're dealing with, for the most part, a lot of this stuff becomes a bit of a hassle. It's like, on a standard printer, you once you get all those macros on there, great, but if you ever need to tweak them, you got to pull up the SD card and do all this other stuff. So when you have a full-featured system and it gives you that web interface or file interface as a very standard part, you have so many luxuries, that you can take for granted. Um, on our side, we have a lot to deal with in terms of just getting to the point of being able to, for example, have variable pin numbers for things. Like, there are times when you may want to change those, but I mean, most of the time you don't. The thing is that, yes, it's nice to have, but it's like, just to have that single capability, it's like now you're opening up holes for everyone. Like, you want to be careful to like make sure that only those who really need it or want it will have it, and maybe limit it to certain, features anyway. Like, sure, you want to move end stops around. I could see that being a really important one. So where are the codes to change end stops? I'm sure they're in there. And various other things are in there, and it's like, everything is sort of configurable to the point that it's been implemented that way. And everything else that we're sort of waiting on is like, part of the idea of having unified bed leveling was to sort of start to, as it were, bring those features into a singular bed leveling system. But the theory on unified bed leveling is a little different. Instead of ignoring unreachable areas, it gets you to probe them manually, which is good, so that way you have that whole bed probe. But it does enforce the manual probing part, and it's like sometimes you just don't want that. And actually, it doesn't necessarily enforce it. As long as you set the bed up to be able to be reachable, you make your margins, just make big margins. And the thing is, you are sacrificing some area on the right because of the way it tends to work. But maybe there's ways you can set it up where it'll just do you give it an area and say, okay, ignore the area you can't reach. When the nozzle's the probe, it's not a problem at all. So you get a really good system with that. But a lot of that stuff, like being able to tilt it, for example, none of that ends up being super, super useful. The one thing that we've been talking about, or I've been talking about on these streams a little bit, and I still haven't finished, is getting that the Z offset is back as part of the standard mesh leveling, so that you have a center point that you can always adjust to for your standard, bed height, but then you slowly remove the rest as you're doing the rest of the like the fade part. So there's a part you fade and there's a part you always keep, no matter what. So that's kind of one of the things, and it's like the idea there was just you will end up. I'm thinking it's possible that it'll mess with shifting the Z position. I want to watch for that, but I have to just get the math right, and it should be okay. It's always a question of triple checking the maths on those things. But yeah, the problem with with just taking the bed warp as given is that yeah, you end up with too much area below or too much area above because of the way it measures, and that area gets canceled out, and you don't always want that. But it's very important to just make sure you have a very well zeroed probe to start with, and then you don't have to worry about it. But it's like even with that, it's like I don't know. It would help foolproof it to have that Z offset as kind of an automatic behavior, where it just okay, I see that there's this much offset in the way that it probes, so I'm going to just change it to this. And then from that point forward, it could be like almost transparent. Like I don't know. We could also do a thing where we have like a little mark on the screen, like that just says, "Hey, your settings have changed," and like the little red mark on your window, like the X on your close box or whatever. If you close this, you have to save the settings. Don't forget. Could do a little reminder like that in Marlin or something. Don't forget to save your settings. They have changed. Called a dirty marker. That's what it's called. But yeah, so there's basically it's a question of how do you do those codes, and what do you what do you follow them up with. Some of the things that are taken for granted in one firmware or another are can be tricky due to the architecture of Marlin with its loopy structure. One example was the protocol for getting like commands that are not. We have this emergency command parser, but it's very much a hack in the serial level where it has a little state machine, and then it sets flags, and then if it sees the flags in the main loop, then it deals with it in the main loop. And that was to avoid actual trying to dispatch commands from someplace really low level. You wouldn't want to do that. So we dispatch commands from higher level areas, the main loop, but that can be blocking, and that's kind of partially important. But some of the things that get dispatched there are just flags causing other things to get called to deal with other things. So finishing up an SD print or whatever, closing things up, whatever that needs to be done. So yeah, there's all these kinds of little areas where the way that things have been architected kind of put limitations on like other things. So if you wanted to have some command come in that gets priority just because it is this particular command, you'd either have to implement another special state machine path for it, or come up with another place to get it to go in and get into another buffer. And so kind of got stuck on that. But I'll come back to it. I was going to do some Chameleon 3D stuff today, but I seem to have gotten sidetracked with this other variable pin stuff. It's just, it is, I mean, it's always a question, like what is really wanted. And the thing is that what most people have been demanding for Marlin is like improvements to the motion. And so there's a lot of study going into that. And there's like also I have a bee in my bonnet to fix up the code and refactor it and modernize it as much as possible. And so I spend a lot of time on that. And then it's like, we're always putting endless hours into all the things that need to be done. And then someone comes along and it's like, but you haven't done this, have you? And why haven't you? And we've had it for years. I'm like, God, well, yeah. You haven't had this disease I've had for years called the pile, the pile of work that needs to get through. And it's like I would love to tear apart the whole underpinnings of Marlin and get it to be more variable based, but it's not just a matter of one little piece and then you're all done. Like I'll have to go into this whole like rabbit hole of what are the different codes that pertain to configuring RepRap firmware, and what do I have to watch out for there. Configuration, let's see, units to millimeters, okay. Maximum feed rate, home, microstepping, print settings, I don't know, I'm looking. Push and pop, those are cool. Push a state of some kind. I gotta really work on these. What's this? M120 push. I don't know why it's way up here. G push. What are we pushing? The state of the machine. Oh, see, we don't have a lot of stack space, but we could figure that out. We can figure out what to do with this stack thing. Oh, it's part of the macro thing. I see. Whether units are inches or millimeters, whether or not volumetric extrusion is in use. Yeah, okay, I get you. So that's handy. So yeah, that's handy. It's interesting it's done as a G code. Because like, I guess it makes sense in RepRap firmware terms. Everything is very explicit. And it's the kind of thing that you would want to have anyway for whatever purposes. But you got to know what's pushed and what's popped, right? And each version as you go. And newer and older versions might not be pushing and popping all the same stuff. It gets a little hairy after. But stick with the latest version. Keep flashing new firmware onto your board all the time, and you'll be fine. Like you're trying to avoid. Report, get firmware version, display filament diameter, print settings. What else we got? Yeah, I think that the point is you're always going to be flashing new stuff. It's just unavoidable. And if you're using boards instead of a Raspberry Pi with a web interface to download it and install it on there automatically, just make sure you always use a web interface to install it automatically. And if there's settings to migrate or the macros have to change, you'll get to it eventually. M119, I'm looking for those pin type things. Printing, probing. Set identity transform. Set a Z probe point. Probe Z and calculate Z plane. G32. So yeah, that would be like something we could throw in. G31, set or report current status. Oops. Let's see. Physical macro, return from macro. Yeah, we have something that's very similar to macros already in Marlin, actually. It's been there from the start, which is subprogram, but it's used to not M98, I think it's, there's another code for it, M30, something like that. And they're not expressed as macros, they're just expressed, you just run another G code file. And yeah, you can do that. Actually, I worked on that and fixed it up at one point, and I don't know how stable it is right now. I haven't been back to revisit it, but I spent some good time on that and got it working. Being able to have one file open another file, which opened another file, and then return, and everything worked up and down to some depth level. And then I did the M808 thing. That was fun. That was handy. Return from macro subprogram. Yeah, so expressing it like a macro subprogram. I did actually start a pull request for that, hoping to get it more filled out. And the problem is, just like, again, it's like you have to open a file and make sure that you're opening and closing this one file and you're not interfering with other files that might be open for a job, and making sure that, because you're basically, again, you are doing a stack thing. So you put a stack, and that was just tricky with the various things we had going on with AVR and the different platforms, but it could definitely be built. I mean, it's not too far off from what we've got now. But there's so many little things that need to be built out just in that area, just modernizing the SD code and stuff in general. But I could see doing this with a stack of, file references, for example, or a structure that's, got the file reference in it anyway. Like stuff being built around the SD card code it's kind of never been, it's been getting slowly tweaked and adjusted to get features in there, but and has been modernized to some extent, as much as I've been able, but there is more to be done for sure, to kind of like think more about like using something like that structure with a file reference in it, for example, and the position of the file and so forth, and keeping a stack of those things where do you put it? You know, is that a file system element, or do you? I guess you kind of think of it that way because you wouldn't necessarily do this macro subprogram stuff from any other context, like from an external host kind of a concept. But I suppose in some sense I mean, you do start one. So I don't know. It's one of those things I always worry about. It's like, well, what about the context? What if someone does it from here? And got to think about those. Should you ignore it, or then you got run macro pause or stop from a pin state change. So this has an external trigger concept. So this is probably used for a lot of interesting things. This is the external trigger, and that's M581. Let's take a look at that one. Yeah, so configure an external trigger. So there's some logical trigger number that is TNN, 0 up to a firmware specific maximum, so 9 for RepRap, and I guess they have specific numbers that do certain things. That always worries me, the mystery meat. You know, oh well, 3 on this firmware does this, and 7 on this firmware does that. Just remember. I mean, as long as it's well defined, that's all right, but that's one of the standards that has to be sort of picked up. But again, I just don't like things being numerical if you can avoid it. Like, number 7, it's just mystery meat, you know? It doesn't have a meaning to it so much. But again, none of these G codes really does, right? YM581. You know, it's all arbitrary, right? And then the condition whether to trigger only when printing. Yeah, so there's some cool logic that goes on there. So yeah, you're building up again. This is just one of those areas where we just have been avoiding making things that use lots of RAM buffers. But again, if anybody ever wanted to build this, they certainly could have and brought it to us, and it worked. And if I had a great use, we could have some fun with it. And so, you know, what gets triggered and how is also a question. You know, like if the buffer is blocked, you know, you want to make sure that you have some way to get things through, that if that's what you're going to be doing. But if they're, you know, standard triggers and you have a triggering system, it's all flags anyway. I don't know, maybe you just look for those 9 flags and you just deal with it in some way inside the firmware. Whatever, right? But trigger 0 is your emergency stop. So trigger 1 is like a pause. And then you call these trigger macros. So yeah, it can trigger a macro. So once we have macros, you know, that would be kind of cool. Then you get 582, check for a trigger. Gonna have to fix that those links. I don't know what's going on with that. But yeah, trigger number to poll, and it just polls it, and then I suppose it returns back. It'd be checked, and then yeah, so you can do that. So if you used M581 to do an out-of-filament sensor, so yeah, it's a very cool general way to do stuff. So you don't have to have a lot of. You can take some complex behaviors out of your firmware and replace them with macros and use that instead. I've been kind of anxious to have something a little more like that. I mean, we talked about it probably a lot early on. I was like, well, we have all this stuff that's going on. Like, we've got, you know, in any kind of probing situation, you have a move to do this and then that, and you do this and that and this. And each time we do that, we've got these, you know, these calls in there to just do a move, do blocking move or whatever. And so it was like, well, initially it was that we built the do blocking move kind of system, and then it was like, okay, now we could figure out a way to express these in some other way. Like, let's have a data structure, and you call a thing, and it does these moves according to the structure. So those things could be built out. But you know, using a macro system is nice too. It's just, again, it's not the most efficient way, and it may not even be the most reliable way. I always worry about the failure of the SD card or whatever to produce things. And also, again, for Marlin, it was a lot of it was the tethered machine is what you kind of expect as almost a norm for a while. Moving to the SD card became a thing for a lot of people because your machine might go to sleep, or you know, the USB connection would fail, or some other weird glitch would happen. And so using an SD card just became kind of the reliable way I would go, and a lot of people did. But having an SD card on the board itself wasn't always the thing. It was even more likely that you would have it on your display. And then you didn't necessarily have the fastest speeds and other things, but you know, you've got all that extra storage on the SD card, so being able to use it for things like macros and external programs is, you know, a cool thing, and that capability has been in Marlin for a while. So not having it been implemented as M98 is interesting, but again, it's like you don't know that the SD card is going to be there. You can't rely upon it always with every board, and so it was like, for those that you can, these things make some sense. It becomes a more viable thing, but then it's like, we can't make all of Marlin be M98 based. We have to have that now as it would be an option. It would just be an option. It wouldn't be the way it always works. You'd still have to have the other stuff. So you could do things like, okay, well, I want to have filament runout sensor, but instead of calling M600 or whatever, I would call M98 blah blah filament runout. So you just add that as an option, and then we have a thing where it says you're not required to use M600, and all the other code can be not compiled in. But once it relies on the macro stuff being there first. So I did start that. It's there. It's just a matter of getting that finished, and then having elements supplanted by someone who wants to do that. You know, it just hasn't been a big demand. Again, we're just kind of following a demand. You know, someone on Twitter giving us grief because it hasn't been done yet, and it's been on firmware for years, and on some other place, it's like, well, it's there. It's kind of just needs to be filled out. It needs to be, you know, made more formal. And again, it's just a matter of determination and time and ability. Stand by your bed, M144. Okay, I gotta look at that one. Bed standby, okay, so yeah, that's, switch the bed heater to standby temp, M140 S1 turns it back to active temp. So that's something that could certainly be implemented. There's no reason not to do that. And then as far as what is the standby temp, set bed heater to standby, it's got just a state. So it's got P and S, which is fine. That's standard G-code type behaviors. P and S. But yeah, where do you set the actual value? It's probably in there somewhere. It's a configuration thing. So yeah, I'm still looking for those pins though. Set drive mapping, gotcha. Was done with M569, so now you've got that. So, you know, again, like, I feel like a slouch because these aren't in there yet, but again, it's not the theory that Marlin is built on. It's built on that. Make the build as small and tight as possible, and not looking up pins in a table, you know, which I guess, you know, it's more likely for RAM to get messed up by a stray cosmic ray than for ROM. So things are better left in ROM, right? As much as possible. I mean, you wouldn't want the wrong pin to get triggered because some stray cosmic ray came along. Everything's a trade-off, right? You want this thing, you can have it, but it's at the expense of slightly less safety. Just slightly less. We could do a double check, you know, if you really need hardened systems for, like, you know, places where you don't want to catch on fire, like everywhere. Then you could do that. So what else we got? End stop configuration. Let's see how that works. I gotta see where there's got to be something where it says pin number, pin, 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 pin to pin, pin to pin, ping, mapping, pin, pin, switch IO pin. Oh, I'm 42. Okay, well, I'm telling you, the whole M43 thing was built for in Marlin. Pin report and debug so that we could get more, so devs could have an easier view of that stuff. Let's see, pin, because you need to be able to see that. Oh, here's one. Name of the pin used to control the power supply. Aha, I found one. Invert the PS on output for the mean well power supplies. M80C. Yeah, I don't know if you need. Do you really need to be able to? I mean, I suppose if your firmware is all pre-built and you're going to connect up a new power supply, that makes sense. But you wouldn't want that bit to get flipped, to tell you. Marlin requires power supply. Ramps wiring. Prusa requires PS on pin defined. Yep, I think we have PS on pin as well. Yeah, to enable M80. So that's interesting. Anyway, I was looking for the word pin, right? Pin, 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 pin. So pin. I pin, 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 pin. Outputs the configuration of the pins. P200. M122, P200. That's a kind of a good one, probably. That's like similar to M43. We could do that kind of thing. It's basically what we have is the same as similar to that. M122, P200. Like again, you know, compatibility stuff. These can always be added pretty quickly. Stuff like that. It'd be similar. I guess it wouldn't put out the same report, but wait for pin state. Right, we do have that. Baby stepping. Set or report sensor parameters. Okay, so here's one where we actually do have a pin. So the question, of course, becomes, like, we have a M43 has the ability to interpret pin names in a certain way, so we'd have to just basically use the same methodology that it uses to do the pin interpretations. But here we have p pin name for, and it's in quotes, so I don't know if that's, I don't know how we work things in the Marlin, man. We don't necessarily need quotes, but we can do it if it needs to be quotes. Okay, these are pretty complex because it's already pre-built. There's already code in there for all these sensors ready to go. So yeah, we do have them. We just have to make it possible to build them all simultaneously. Which you can. There's some sensors that are like not allowed on because it's just hard-coded in a certain way. But been meaning to do more of that refactoring. Again, it's just a question of refactoring this stuff that's old legacy stuff. So yeah, pin M308, set or report sensor parameters. Some you have extras for thermistors, PT1000 sensors, and so forth. So these are sensors. I don't think those count for end stops. There's your microstepping mode, of course you have that. Power loss recovery, M911 in rep firmware. Select CNC printer mode. M453, of course, there's different printer modes you can go for. We haven't expanded into printer modes, but I've been meaning to, especially for laser, since that's an add-on for a lot of printers. I did implement that for Maker ARM, which is one reason I've been shy to bring it in and shy to take more contracts. I just want things to be open as much as possible. P5 selects a switch in pin of the Z probe connector, etc., etc. What's this one? Set Z probe type. Right on. So yeah, the pin isn't one of the things, is it? Select a switch for bed probing. So switches are a thing, I assume. Tool settings, spindle RPM. Logical pin number, set output on extrude. Okay, gotcha. That can be handy for certain things. Turns the controlled pin output on whenever extrusion is being done. So for whatever reason, you could have a stirrer. So yeah, that's one of those things. Could certainly be added. That seems like a fairly straightforward one. It's actually just attached to a pin with either an S output value or a frequency on F for PWM. Yeah, and a pin number on P. So yeah, interesting. I got you. So it's a PWM in this particular case. Although you could probably, maybe you don't need a PWM. If you set it to like 100% or 255 or whatever, it would be always on, right? And then you got your external trigger. You got your drive mapping. And of course, with a given board, you know for that board, where the drives are. So you don't need to worry about like setting pins per se. You can just map them. And you just define your, then instead of defining X, Y, Z, E, you just define, first, second, third, fourth, whatever. Just assume they'll be mapped by some standard method. Again, that's a level of indirection, which again, we haven't added again to Marlin yet, but which is there for the add-ons. Like it's just an early convenience to have it like automatically pick the next thing for like Z2 or X2 or whatever. So there's a little bit of configuration automation in there for you. But as fun as that was to make, it would be nicer if you had just a mapping kind of concept. But again, that's another level of indirection, and it's like we have to make it both so it can be statically compiled, and also then if you want to make it configurable at runtime, you turn on a switch and you get slightly more code and more RAM usage, but you get what you want. Like that's just a question of getting that working. Control digital trim pot, set microstep ping. Yeah, so in general, I mean, if you know what's on the board, then you can very quickly map things. Like you know what the end stop pins are. You can have them, you can have a mapping without needing to mention the pin name or number. You just map it to the number 3 of end stop or whatever. So yeah, how this all works and which things do what. Interesting questions. But yeah, like then the last thing is, so yeah, there's pins associated with certain functions and so forth. So it's just a question of how do you map them. I think the gab today was more about macros and the fact that macros are awesome and that everything's configurable at runtime and all this other stuff. Although that wasn't even at all really the point of what I posted on Twitter, which was more about this configurable not at runtime but at compile time thing, which I demonstrated and showed to you, which is more about having a simpler time with dealing with like tweaking your config or having control over multiple configs. Like you could conceivably, for example, have a folder full of these different config.ini files, which are, somewhat simplified compared to, and you just have small tweaks to each one or whatever, or you could generate them more easily than you could generate a full Marlin header file, and so with its defines and all of its other crap. And then this also is just part of the fact that we're demonstrating that yes, we can parse a config and produce some different generative output that's useful for other purposes, particularly for configurator tools or for conversion to database or for producing documentation. So that's the next thing I will be exploring, is getting into like, okay, now that I'm producing this, okay, what next? Let's get on with the next part, which is okay. Still got basic in it. Let's Let's make my signature thing not do basic anymore. Config basic, oops, and config advanced. And I think that's it, right? Yeah. Sure, that's all good. I know what I'm doing. Sig. Yeah, so config dump. Actually, if config dump is just one, then it'll do, instead of doing the embed, like of the zip file, it'll still produce the JSON. So set to 1 to dump config.ini. I should probably mention that it'll do a JSON if you just do 1. Smaller words, right? And yeah, I still only want to, oh, what did I miss? What did I miss? Oh. Okay. That's right. Okay. Yeah, very blank. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so anyway, this is actually quite nifty. I was excited about it. I thought others might get the idea, but yeah. So that's kind of the thing is like, yeah, you're gonna be flashing your next version of RepRap firmware probably anyway. The whole idea of the thing being like take a board out of your tool changer and stick it in your Delta and run a different config file is all well and good, but you're still managing a pile of config files, a pile of macro files, and this is no more portable than what we're doing here. I don't see the great advantage in the long run is, yeah, you can be tweaking things while you're running the firmware. I think that's one of the great advantages. You can go to the web interface and you can be tweaking all that stuff while you're doing it. But we don't have that on your average RepRap, ramps board, whatever. We're gaining more of that on 32-bit boards and so forth. But then there is also this whole migration to like the Raspberry Pi side of things where, well, now you're just going to be SSHing into your board and doing things that way maybe, or you'll have an interface that's been set up and customized to that. And that's the way that people like to work now, is like working through this Raspberry Pi style interface or whatever. And we can't be playing catch up with everybody, chasing all the different trends. We have to just keep working on the foundations that we need to work on to get things working the way that works best for getting our features filled out and things like that. I mean, just like my focus right now just very much has to be on things like this configuration stuff to kind of start to wrangle a schema out of it and get our, all the things that are configurable, wrangle that, find new ways to deal with configurations. Maybe it is more modular, and allow for that option if people are into it. Not necessarily use the libs folder, or the lib folder, I guess. If this is called libs, it doesn't, things in here don't get built. There's one, if you make one called lib, things in there will get built, and I've tested it and it works. But still, it still reads the config and produces libs according to the config. Saves a little time on the build, maybe. But every time you change stuff, it does rebuild. So, you know, there's kind of like, there's no super major advantage to so many of these things that we could approach. I do like the fact that we get a nice monolithic build, and then once it's built, it's there and it just does what it's supposed to do. And there isn't a lot of changing of pins and so forth. To me, that seems fine. Like, I don't see the need to do that so often that it's like needs to be there. And yeah, I'd love to have some of the conveniences though that we talk about, like being able to do let me pull this out of the way here. Hold on a sec. There was one thing I was going to do. Oh, I was doing my release work, so I'll deal with that in a minute. I'll get off this stream pretty soon. I'm just rambling at this point. But yeah, I feel like I could definitely do more in the way of getting good current documentation out, and that's part of what this is about as well. I had to get my head around the scripting of this signature stuff to pull stuff out of this config and see what see what it looks like, and then from that process, like, okay, now that I'm parsing like the whole file and pulling stuff out, or pulling stuff out of stuff that was already parsed out for me, I guess you could say, can I go into the file and line by line, like here I'm doing this line by line stuff, and use this matching stuff here, and then look around those lines and say, okay, which parts are comments that go with it, and gather those into a structure, and then spit out some Jekyll at this point, like right in here. I mean, I could use this, but I also want to take this stuff out. And there's some stuff I've been reading up on, how do you do a script like this that works inside of one context as a little library, but then you can also use it if it sees that you're running it from a shell. What can you do? And I don't know that I can get like everything I would get from running a build that I would from the shell. So, but if I can get some code together that does, the parsing of the lines in the defines and so forth, and it's all written. I don't know. Python's fun. I'm having fun with it. But I'd like to get it all in. I have it all in JavaScript as well. So it's just a matter of doing that, pulling this out, getting the structure out, and writing it out in some form. I know the work is being done, but I always feel a little bit like I don't see it every day, and I want to kind of be more involved. Or in some sense, I want to see the progress as it's being made in that, and see where it's going, and kind of add my 2 cents, and see what we can, see from this. What can we produce out of the whole structure? So I don't know. There's definitely a lot to be done there. I really want to especially produce good documentation and for different versions, and be able to just pump that out. The Jekyll build takes forever, but hey, it's being done over on GitHub servers, and it should go quicker that way. So if we happen to add, dozens of pages, but that's part of it, is I wanted to keep the number of pages down. So, but again, if you build the stuff in a structured way, like, you can definitely parse it more easily with something like a Jekyll situation. Which, if you've seen our documentation, like here's an example of this YML here that's going to get read and then used in the Jekyll to produce the download page later. And then here's some more, which is inside of the HTML that you can, as long as it's in the front matter, so-called front matter, like the Jekyll stuff knows what to do with it, and we'll include it in your template stuff down here. So like this kind of thing is like, I just need to make a template like this, and then have the scripts generate this kind of stuff. And then when I run my Jekyll to generate the site, it'll all go into some folder. Like, I don't know, configuration maybe, down here, and maybe 209 or one of these things, you know. It'll put the right stuff in the right place. And then it'll end up with all the stuff. And then when I run the generator, it'll look beautiful. And it'll also go into the search engine and search data and all that. And then it'll be much more easy to see our docs. It's been I know there's probably folks that specialize in this, and I wish I could find them. Like putting out the call, so to speak, for different things has been a little challenging. Because I don't know, there's just so many things to do, and it's like bringing another individual in to manage is like great because they take on that extra burden, but then it's another person that's like, oh, who are you again? Oh, right, you're doing this thing. I haven't talked to you in weeks. What's going on? It's just like keeping it all straight can be a challenge. But hey, that's the whole idea of having these scripts wrangle it all. We're gonna have great configuration documentation soon. This one monolithic page, giant 5,000 line page here is gonna go bye-bye and be replaced by much nicer stuff. Like all this stuff is, you notice how it's all very explicit, like, and the question is like how much, you know, like we wanted to show both the original code and then also the documentation around it, but without the comment, without having it all be comments, but then some of it is comments. So it's like, how are we going to pull that into the new documentation? This should get its own page, you know, like everything should be linked from a central place, organized by theme and category and so forth. And that's really what I'm after, is to build that. And that's it's a kind of specialized thing, you know, you're basically doing some kind of conversion from one form to a structure and then pulling that structure into another. And it's like, do you need that intermediate structure, or can you go straight from, say, configuration file to Jekyll documentation page? I feel like it can be a little of all of the above. Things definitely need to be set up in a hierarchical way where everything is apparent and you know what the parents of things are and their relationships are, and you can pull that out. So coming up with a schema, again, is the initial part. No one's scrambling and yelling at me on like the Twitter to definitely get that schema done. Get that schema done. Get those trailing spaces pulled out of there. Refactor that pin class and that fast IO. No one gets at the underpinnings of what needs to be done. Like I wish more people were demanding that. Like get those underpinnings done. Because that would maybe light a fire, but I don't know. I'm doing what I can. And tonight I'm actually doing what I can to get out the next tagged versions, because we've been doing lots of patches and they're good. Good patches, lots of good patches. And I wanted to put in Gyre's UI back in before I do that, so I'm going to get on with that. Have a little dinner and then get on with that. And yeah, tomorrow I'll be doing my regular stream at 2 o'clock, so come on by, tune in then, and yeah, we'll hang out. So cheers, everybody. It's been fun. And yeah, I'll get into that chameleon stuff tomorrow as well. By then I'll have the release out, and then I'll have more you know, interesting bug reports, I'm sure, coming in and stuff. And that should make things more interesting for everyone. So anyway, cheers. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, click all those links. There's a nice new support page on GitHub for the Marlin Foundation, I want to say foundation, organization. And if you're already supporting me, you're doing great. Thank you. I appreciate it. It really allows me to dive into this stuff. Yeah, I'm gonna be diving into the things that I've been hearing about, macros and so forth. I mean, gosh, I did get a start. It's been there for months. I just hope someone will come along and finish my PRs, but I guess I got to finish my own PRs. So be it. Anyway, talk to you soon.